Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to play around with some of my alcohol inks. I'm going to create a Christmas colored type background. And after that, I'm going to use my alcohol ink lift pad as well as the re-inker to create Christmas cards with these backgrounds. I'm just using alcohol inks. I'm not using any mixatives or metallics in them, so I'm just blending them around with some isopropyl alcohol. I have some in a dropper bottle and some in a mister bottle, just at the off chance that at some point I want to rehydrate the entire thing. But most of the time I'll just use the dropper bottle if I want to rehydrate or just add some alcohol to a certain area. As I'm working, I'm going to be moving the alcohol inks around with my alcohol ink blower tool, and I'm working on Yupo, which is a synthetic paper or a plastic paper. In order to use the alcohol lift ink, you need to work on a non-porous surface, and this is a non-porous surface. So as you'll notice as I'm working that I will add a little bit of isopropyl, I'll add different colors of inks as I feel they're needed in certain areas, and then I'll use my blower tool to blow them around and move them around. And I just keep doing this until I have a background that I like. Because I'm doing the lift ink technique, I'm just interested in having some complete coverage and getting a nice disbursement or a nice amount of the different colors in the different areas. I'm trying to avoid having a lot of alcohol ink buildup, which is the darker areas, just because when I use that alcohol lift ink, it tends not to lift that whole amount up. So I'm trying to avoid that as much as possible. There is going to be some there, and I'm not too worried about there being some, but I want to avoid there being a lot of it. I'm not looking for a masterpiece of a background here. I'm just looking for something that's got some nice reds and nice greens. I'm doing a Christmas card here, so I want to make sure that I can see both of those colors because they're kind of traditional colors. Once I have my background done how I'd like, I'm going to let that dry completely and make sure that all of that alcohol ink is completely dried before we move on to the next step, which is stamping with the lift ink. As soon as my background is done, I'm going to be using my Misti stamping tool in order to position my stamp and stamp it. This way, if I want to restamp it to lift up more ink, I know that I'm going to have some precise positioning. I don't have to worry about trying to get that stamp in the exact same spot if I've already set it up in my Misti. Now I'm using a solid script stamp here. You could use outline stamps as well, or line work stamps. Those will work just as well with the alcohol lift ink. You just won't see quite as much of the color variation, but they will absolutely work. So I'm taking that alcohol lift ink pad and I'm generously inking up my stamp, and then I'm going to press it firmly on my background. I'm going to press around and make sure that I've got good contact with that stamp and my background, and then I'm going to take that background out of my Misti, put in some glossy cardstock. So this is a clay coated cardstock that is great for alcohol inks. You could stamp this alcohol lift ink on anything, regular cardstock will work, but alcohol inks really shine with glossy cardstock. It just makes them brighter in my opinion, and I just really love how they look. While that dries, I'm going to take some clean paper towel and I'm going to blot my background 4 times on 4 different parts of that paper towel, 4 different clean areas of that paper towel. And I'm rubbing to make sure to lift up and absorb that lift ink that is on there. You want to do this as many times as you need to get the lift ink off before you start to rub it, and I find 4 times is about the sweet spot. So once you're done lifting it like this, you can take clean areas of the paper towel and you can start to rub it. You'll notice that 4th time that I blotted it, not much ink came up, and that's a good indication that most of it's up and it's a good time to start rubbing it. And you'll notice as you rub it, you do get a little bit of excess ink off of there. Any of the areas that have not removed are some of those areas where that alcohol ink built up and made a thick coat. You can, if you want, put this back in the Misti and use your lift ink and lift it up again. I like the way it looks right now, but if that's something that you want a cleaner look, you could do it again. To remove that alcohol ink and the lift ink off of your stamp, I just use some Stays-On stamp cleaner and it does the trick. Then I'm going to take my background and I'm going to trim it down a little bit. That Yupo paper was from an 8x10 pack, so it was 4x5, so it was an odd size for a card front. So I wanted to make sure to trim it down to make sure that it was going to fit nicely on the front of a card. I've got my backgrounds here, my mats, my card bases, and I'm just gluing those pieces on there, and I'm gonna let that dry, and I usually use an acrylic block to hold it down, make sure everything's nice and flat. That frees up my hands to work on other things while I'm doing that. So I'm gonna do it for all the layers except for my alcohol ink background, and I'm going to leave that aside. I wanna add some die cut, some greenery to this, but I wanna use the negative part of my die cut as a bit of a stencil to do a little bit of a technique with the Lift Ink re-inker. So off camera, I went and I die cut all those pieces, and now I have my cardstock that has the greenery cut out. I'm using a dauber tool, a ink blending tool from Tim Holtz, and it just has the sponge in it. I'm using a little bit of the re-inker, and I'm tapping it on this cardstock and using it as a stencil. And I'm using different areas because cardstock is absorbent. It's not going to work exactly the same as a regular stencil, so I don't want to use the same area over and over again. And then I'm going to blot it up the same 4 times as I did before with clean areas of my cardstock, sorry, of my paper towel, making sure to lift that ink up. And you're going to see the negative part of it's going to look like branches on the side. Now, because my Yupo is white, it's not going to be green, obviously, but it's just going to mimic some of that texture that I'm going to be adding with those die cuts. And once again, after I've blotted them all, I'll use a clean part of that paper towel and I will rub it. Now that my background is completely done, I can glue that onto the base of my card, and then once that is dry, I'll start to add my die cuts. I'm gluing my layers with Distress Collage Medium, and I'm also going to be gluing those die cuts with the Distress Collage Medium. I like using a liquid glue because it gives me a little bit of wiggle time if I need to move my layers. And when I go and add the die cuts to it, it's also going to dry completely clear and completely matte. So if anything oozes out or seeps out, you're not going to see it. For my die cuts, before I glue them to my card, I'm going to enhance them a bit. The berries on this one here, I'm just going to put a little bit of glossy accents on there, and then I'm going to set that aside to dry. Before putting my glossy accents away though, I'm going to take the bottle and tap it on my surface to make sure I remove any of that glossy accents from the tip. And then I'm going to kind of burp it. So I'm going to squeeze it a little bit. Anything that is in that tip is going to come out. That way I know it's not going to clog. Now that my berries have dried, I'm using an ink blending tool with some brown ink, and I'm inking those stems. And that glossy accents is going to resist that, so I'm not inking them. And then I'm taking some green ink and I'm going to ink my branches. I'll have the colors and everything else I'm using listed and linked down in the description box below. So any specifics or color names that I forgot to mention will be listed down there. Once I've inked these, I'm going to glue them to my card front. I'm just putting them in the top left corner. I am going to be covering that "and" from the sentiment, but I'm okay with that. Most people know this sentiment, so they're going to know what it says, and that "and," in my opinion, isn't a major part of it. For these berries, they're quite long, so I'm going to cut them into 2. And once I've got them glued with my greenery, you're never going to know that they've been cut. I'm gluing them with that same Distress Collage Medium that I glued my layers together with. This gives me the freedom to move things around if I decide that I want them positioned a little bit different. And I can also tuck things underneath if I decide I want a layer tucked underneath where it currently is. I'm using some greenery die cuts and the berry die cuts from Sizzix, and those poinsettia die cuts are from a Spellbinders set, and they're perfect size for this. One of the ways that I like to do, or one of the things that I like to do with the poinsettias, is use my fingers to curve the petals a little bit. It just helps give them a little bit more life and a little bit more dimension. There's 2 different poinsettia sizes within the set, and I'm using 2 of the big ones and 1 of the small ones. And because I use my finger to curve those petals, I'll use the die pick to hold that center in place to make sure that that glue has good contact. I love these sizes of the poinsettias, and they've got some nice detail in them with different cuts in the petals themselves, and it makes them look a lot more interesting. By putting these poinsettias in the corners, it covers any branches or ends of the die cuts from the foliage, as well as the fact that it gives the card a focal point. I'm going to put some Tonic Nouveau drops in gold in the center of the flowers, and you'll see after I do that I change my mind and decide that I want to put some Pink Fresh glimmer or glitter gems in the center. I just remembered that I just got them and I thought they would look really, really pretty and add a little bit of sparkle. So I'm just going to use those Tonic Nouveau drops to hold them in place. You're going to see a tiny little bit of the Tonic Nouveau drops on the outside. I don't mind that. If it was something that bothered me, I would take a Q-tip or something and remove the Nouveau drops before putting the gem in there. But it's something that I don't think anyone would actually really notice unless it was pointed out to them. So here are the cards while the glue is wet, and now they've dried. I think they look fantastic, and I love using that alcohol lift ink because it creates two different backgrounds, so you get two cards in one. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. I really appreciate it. I hope you have a fantastic day.